So my monologue today focused on how so much of the regulations around masking were purely political. But those weren't the only purely political decisions made during the pandemic. For example, why could Walmart and Costco see a steady stream of shoppers, but churches, sometimes churches right across the street, were severely limited, sometimes to just 10 people in the case of a funeral? Scientifically, of course, we know that doesn't make any sense. But neither do those rules respect the fundamental values our Western civilization was founded upon: religious freedom, the ability to gather together for people to make their own healthcare decisions, and to be dictated by their own conscience. Joining me now is someone I haven't seen in quite some time, and that's my fault. It's Pastor James Coates from GraceLife Church, one of the few churches in all of the country that followed the biblical directives of choosing God's law over an unjust government edict. Pastor James Coates, thanks for joining me. It's so great to see you.
It's great to see you too, Sheila. Thank you for having me.
Now, we're having you on the show today because you've written a brand new book. Tell us about it.
Well, I've co-authored a book with Nathan Busenitz. Nathan Busenitz is one of the pastors at Grace Community Church with John MacArthur. And in that book, we are both telling the story of what happened at each respective church in our battle with the governing authorities as we decided to keep our church open in the face of these government edicts. And then we even provide a framework. We see that in this season, the church has been exposed as weak on both its ecclesiology as it relates to the doctrines of the church, as well as our relationship as churches to the governing authorities. And so we wanted to provide a framework for the believer, the Christian, the church to be able to understand when it's necessary to practice civil disobedience, and when that threshold is breached, where we must obey God, not men. And so we're telling the story because we think the story provides a really wonderful illustration of the kind of gospel courage we're talking about and calling for. And then we have a framework to equip the church to be able to know when it's time to obey God, not men.
You know, for those people who are watching who don't know, and I don't know how they could possibly not know, but Pastor James, you spent 35 days in jail because you refused to force the government rules on the congregation at GraceLife Church. And just wonderful people. They welcomed me there. I made so many friends that are still my friends now during my time there reporting on that. But it went further than that. They also seized your church for almost 3 months. The building itself forced your congregation underground, basically having to hold services in secret like the early Christians to prevent the government from ticketing you, fining you, breaking up the congregation. And it was in stark contrast. And I think that's why this book is so important. You're telling the story of two churches, GraceLife and Grace Community, and the very different outcomes when you stood up to the government. Why don't you tell us a little bit? Canadians may not be as familiar with Grace Community, but I am, because Devin from GraceLife, thank you very much, gave me my John MacArthur study Bible that stays on the desk here. But why don't you tell us a little bit about what happened at Grace Community?
Well, they refused to comply with the government edicts that were being levied against them with respect to their gatherings and the health orders, and that ended up into the court system. And in their court system, with their constitution being what it is, the courts ruled in their favor that the governing authorities did not have the ability to prevent Grace Community Church from gathering. And so in their court system, they were able to actually get support for religious liberty and freedom. Now, in reality, their stance, as ours, was not a political stand. It wasn't primarily about religious liberty per se. It was a theological stand where we were taking a stand on the headship of Christ over his church, in effect saying to the governing authorities, you don't have the authority to dictate to the church the terms of worship. And so that was fundamentally what the stand was, but their court system did support them in that stand, and that's vastly different than what we experienced here in our country.
That was an excerpt from my daily TV-style show called The Ezra Levant Show. Each weekday, I do a monologue on the news of the day, then I interview a fascinating guest. I read some fan mail or hate mail, depends on which I like more, and we end with a video of the day. You can get it all at rebelnewsplus.com.